everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the first panel over here on Gehenna Gaming's Virtual Horror Con. I'm a disembodied voice behind the camera right now. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in early in the morning for me over here in the East Coast of the United States, but not for our guests today. Thank you all for joining us. Virtual Horror Con is sponsored by Drive-Thru RPG and Astral Tabletop. Big thank you to them for supporting us this year, and we are also raising money for some fantastic causes that I will drop links to in a minute, but you can see a donation bar on your screen. We are raising money for Black Girls Code and the Blind Cat Rescue and Sanctuary, so help us support them and do some great work as we roll into 2021. Again, I want to thank our panelists for joining me. We have a great lineup here to talk about horror in international tabletop. So I will hand it over to them to introduce themselves and start the conversation. John.
Me. Hello, everyone. I'm John Burke. I am an RPG writer and developer from Paisley in Scotland now. I've moved house. And yeah, I've been going at this now for 4 or 5 years, possibly. Have to add and count together, and it's not my strong point, but yeah, I think that's about right. And mainly working for Onyx Path, and I'd say the most notable titles I have worked on would be Vampire the Masquerade, Mummy the Curse, and the They Came From series of games, which are the most fun you will ever have at your table. And that's my shameless plug finished.
And Klara.
Hello, everyone. I'm Klara, and I'm also a writer and developer from Denmark, the cold north. I've worked together with John on many projects, and I've also been a writer for at least 3.5 years maybe, and developer for half a year. So I'm very new in that still. I worked on Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Forsaken. I worked on Cults. I worked on Mummy, and I worked on Silent Sigil, and they came from many different places. So yeah, that's basically what I've been doing.
And Allan?
Hi there, everybody. I'm Allan Carey. I run a small creative business in Melbourne, Australia called Type 40. We focus on immersive props for role-playing games. I'm also the Chaosium community content ambassador for the Miskatonic repository, and have for the past 6 months been releasing short role-playing games on Drive-Thru Roleplay under the name Seeds of Terror. And that's about me.
And last but not least, Hugh.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hugh Angseesing. I'm the Chief Exec of Black Chantry Productions, a small little company based in Nottingham in the UK. And we publish Vampire the Eternal Struggle. So we're the 3rd publisher that's had this game in its lifetime. So the Vampire the Masquerade card game that's been going for 27 years now.
Thank you. A reminder to those viewing, you can drop questions in the chat throughout the panel, and I will be directing them over to our panelists. But just to get the conversation flowing, just wanted to ask you all to talk a little bit more about the games you've worked on and kind of where your influences come from on those games.
Well, I start then. Well, so if we want to start from the top, again, the biggest product I've worked on is probably Vampire. And first and foremost, I played that game a long time over various editions before I wrote for it. So I think I had a pretty solid idea of what the kind of creative voice of that title was. But obviously had my own stuff to add. I think like everyone here would say the same thing. You've always got, especially for a product you're close to, or a title that you've played and that you've enjoyed, you've always got your own seeds, some from your own games and things like that. And probably, again, something everyone will agree with, the role-playing in general gives you these kind of ideas, because ultimately you're creating stories to tell at the table, and you think, oh, I could just write that down and make it a book. So that's, in terms of my kind of writing, that's where it's all really come from there. I think in the horror sense, I am highly interested, and I've always been in not so much the sort of horror, if you want, that comes from without. And I think a lot of horror, especially European horror, is always about what's beyond the boundaries, what's what's outside the normal, what's beyond the village, what's out there, what's across the other side of the hill. And I always quite liked and resonated more with horror that came from within, horror that is about something that a real person could feasibly do if pushed to an extreme, or if exposed to some kind of warped mindset or something like that twists them and makes someone who you could otherwise see as kind of reasonable be actually really scary. So that sort of psychological stuff has always really interested me. So They Came From doesn't really feature too much of that. It's very much B-movie style, one note, this is a villainous monster kind of thing. There's a little bit of maybe empathy for the villains sometimes in They Came From. But Vampire, I find, and Werewolf as well, and Mummy really help you get into that, because you are, as a player, often personifying the monster. And if that monster isn't in any way human, if it's a complete outsider, then I don't think the horror is entirely relatable. So I've always been interested in the sort of psychology of that, both when I'm storytelling and writing, trying to discover what could make an interesting, what could be an interesting thing for a person to be turned into a vampire or a werewolf. What could make that more difficult for them? I mean, especially when we were writing cults, and I think Klara will definitely talk about this too, was always discovering, because this is something that happens in the real world. People get drawn into these cultish mindsets. They get taken away from their reality. They get I think the way I always thought about it was you're kind of stripped of context, and what might seem to someone outside of that context as, why would you ever think that? How could you possibly believe it? When you are taken away and immersed in that, and everything that opposes it is stripped away, what does that make you become? And I think Vampire is a very interesting vehicle for that. And in general, horror is always a very interesting vehicle for exploring who we really are, and looking at maybe parts of the human nature that we don't like to discuss and that we don't like to examine. And I'm going to stop talking now, because I could sit here for an hour.
That's brilliant, John. I just want to add like a few bits of where my own mindset's coming from. So mainly working on like a card game. So a lot of the design of the RPG element we're taking straight through into that card game. So we're taking through that horror from Vampire the Masquerade and the kind of the kitsch pulp references, and then we're drawing that through ourselves and adding to that, and the particular elements around that kind of politics and society. So we have a lot of references around how do people interact with each other. So you have things like blood banks being done over by people, and you laugh, but like banks are done over now, or how people are responding to like a pandemic and controlling different bits of resources, and you're getting like vaccine nationalization. There's just a horror of how humans are to each other. So it's not a big jump to get to vampires being horrific to each other, or mummies or werewolves. That horror is already in ourselves already, and the gory, bloody bit is helpful sometimes to really kind of make it really aware. But just that kind of mentality of people can already do that and be quite twisted. So you're just adding a little bit of a flex to make it even more attractive. That's definitely kind of where I've come from.
Yeah, I agree with the both of you. I think something that has inspired me a lot is kind of that very realism-based horror that we do a lot of in Scandinavia. You see a lot of our, I guess, some of our most popular productions are these like crime series where it's very grimy. It's the main character is always depressed. It's always a very realism close kind of entertainment. And what's interesting about, if we're talking about specifically Scandinavian horror, is also that despite that kind of realistic approach, we have a close knitted relationship to everything folklore, because that's something that's dominated our society a lot for a long time. That was why how you explained things, that was what made sense to you. So kind of combining those two, I think is really interesting. I remember one of my scenarios I've written, it's about a cult and joining a cult, but it's very realism based. Like, why would a normal everyday person join a cult? But at the same time, you have this very out there like supernatural part of the story as well. So it's kind of combining those two that I find quintessential, at least Scandinavian horror, but I think a lot of European horror is also like that. And yeah, that's how I approach horror as well. I think what's the most scary thing is what we as humans can do. That doesn't necessarily include supernaturalism. It can, but yeah, that is definitely the most scary thing, what humans are capable of doing.
I'm so impressed with, there's so many different approaches to horror, and we're all talking about the same thing, and we're all furiously agreeing. There are just endless ideas and possibilities when you're writing horror. I am a fanatic Call of Cthulhu player, keeper, writer. I've played all of the other ones. I'm massively into cult. I love Vampire the Masquerade, and I love them. But my approach is always about player experience. When I'm writing, when I'm running games, or even when I'm actually in the game myself as well, it's all about player experience for me, and exploring what you've talked about, which is those personal elements of horror, which are human and something that we all innately understand, but don't necessarily want to experience in real life, but would love to do in the safety of our own home. So, and two of the things that I always try and look at when I'm writing horror is this a long form or a short form? Am I writing a one shot, or is it a longer campaign? How do I build in the same user experience in the short form that I can in a long form, where you've got a lot more scope for building personal touches? And one of the things that I've been experimenting with a lot lately is this idea of what I call 5 choices, 3 actions. I'm all about the hard choice. Give somebody a hard choice at the end of a game or in the middle of a game, and watch them search the depths of what they know they have to do next and realize none of them are good choices. So I think for me, player experience and that personal touch, and then hard choices, is where I approach things from.
And it's interesting to talk about player choice, especially it is something I think a lot about when I'm writing, and I'm sure you all do. And certainly you obviously do, Alan. I haven't mentioned it, but a lot of the time when I'm writing, I feel as if it's almost like you don't want to be prescriptive. So you're there's sometimes I've read things that people have said about stuff that I've written or that other people have written, and it's like, it doesn't tell me enough about this. I want to know, is it this, is it that? I want to know one way or the other, a definitive answer. And it's like, almost as a writer, you're like, well, I don't really want to give you one, because and RPGs are weird that way. Like, if I was writing a novel, I might want to give you an answer, because that's the satisfaction that you derive from it, the player experience or the reader experience. The satisfaction is in uncovering the answer. When you're talking about a role-playing game, it completely changes that, because you can't necessarily tell them the answer. If you're doing that, that's it. The game is this, and there's no room. Well, I mean, the storyteller could obviously still just throw that out and go, well, I'm going to make it different, and that's fine. But I think it's better to just encourage that more, but not saying this character here is the villain, he's monstrous. Like, give them more looks if you want, and more options, and more information that allows them to create a story. And that's always the weird thing I find about RPG, trying to walk that line between, am I giving people enough to create a story of their own without my literally sitting at their table going, right, so now next do this, next do that. But you've given them the seeds to go away and say, well, I've got a wealth of information here, I've got ideas in my head. And it's weird and different in many ways from other sorts of writing. I mean, I've done sort of journalistic type writing in my own job. I do a lot of political stuff, and that's very much about conveying information, deliver whatever it is straight to the person, hook it up to their veins, bang, there's what I'm trying to tell you. And RPG writing is far, far more vague, I guess, than that, and necessarily so, especially if you're talking about a product like Cthulhu, which is itself, I think, highly related to a vampire in that way, where it's like it has to be vague, it has to be mysterious. That's the whole side of it that attracts people, and also takes people into a realm where you're like, you might be trying to understand this from a scientific perspective or a religious perspective, whatever your personal character's idea is, but then you're confronted by the fact that here's a thing that shouldn't exist, but it does, right? And that's always very interesting, especially with Cthulhu, vampire, werewolf, that like, how would someone, I mean, I wrote a character, for example, for Chicago, who is a rabbi, and he was very devout, but was disillusioned by the fact that he'd experienced a lot of stuff, two world wars, basically, and everything that happened around Israel at that point in time, and everything, which I'll not go into. But so that kind of, cast a lot of doubts in his mind. But then suddenly, if you've got that devout faith, being told that here are a lot of things that shouldn't exist, magic, right, supernatural powers, things that you just don't believe in, they exist now. So it casts everything into doubt suddenly. Like everything that science has told you for years that can't exist, or your faith has told you for years can't be possible or can't happen, suddenly there they are. And I think that must be satisfying to any player. So giving them that sort of vagary to explore whatever they want, because obviously it's for them to sit down with their players, like Alan's alluded to, and say, what is it we want to look at here? How far do we want to go? What do we want to explore? And what's the payoff for them is then more easily able to be tailored to who you're sitting at the table with, rather than us kind of prescribing to you, here's what horror is, here's what the jump scares are, here's where you do X, Y, and Z things, and give them those choices and those options to do them by themselves, really.
No, you really want that emotional connection from them. And that's going to be different, right? You can write a scenario for 5 players and 20 different groups run it, and they're all going to get different things out of it. And as Alan said, those choices, right? Those choices aren't right or wrong; they're just horrible. And that's the point. Different groups are going to respond to it in different ways, and you want to get all those different experiences, because that's you try to get an emotional response, right? This is like reading something really intense, or going and watching like I don't know, David Lynch film or something in the cinema. If you remember what those cinema things were, you try to elicit that high degree of interaction with kind of the product. I think that's a beautiful way of talking about it. Indeed, John. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that emotional connection and player interaction and player having a storyteller that can basically inspire their players to make choices, it kind of connects in a way, because if they are more engaged in their character, they will automatically have a more vivid experience and a more emotional experience. I think everyone has tried, at least I have, tried to be in a game where you can definitely tell that the person running the game is very determined to run the story as they wrote it, and every single interaction that might deter them from that path is not accepted, which for me, I'm sure that some people enjoy that, but I must say, for me personally as a player, I think the fun part of RPGs and the fun part of tabletop gaming is you can inspire it from your side. You can manipulate the game from your side. You can alter the direction of the story. So when I, for example, wrote The Sacrifice for Chicago by Night, I made sure that the interaction from the players actually made a difference in the story. It makes a huge difference in the story. it's not just, you know, here's the story and you are just some characters, but you could be any character. It doesn't matter because the story is going to end up exactly how it's written. You want the characters to be an integral part of the story and to actually change it.
I'm really interested to hear people talk about what is essentially player buy-in to horror stories and the immersion and their experience of the game, and being allowed to make the choices that they want to make and not have a prescriptive experience that the writer wanted them to have. And for me, role-playing, this is going to sound very high, but role-playing games are for me probably the best form of medium for telling stories, because you can tailor an experience around the people that you run the game for. If you know those people and you know which buttons to push, you can absolutely tailor an experience to them. And then you can give them that experience and you don't know what the ending is going to be. You could write a novel and you can have somebody read it and they'll enjoy it, but you can give your story to somebody and they don't know what the ending is going to be. The translation of that then, from when you write for people that you know into writing that experience into something you're going to give to other people, and you never know what they're going to do because you'll never meet them. You don't know what experience or what choices they're going to make. So actually distilling that back down and putting that onto paper that you can then give to somebody that you don't have control over, that's a fascinating subject to me. And one of the other things that I've been involved in for a number of years now, since I started doing things in the industry, is making immersive props, particularly for Call of Cthulhu, like the ones you see behind me. It is a picture, but those are real props. So I'm particularly interested in what physical items do to the experience of a person that plays a game. And my go-to example is telling players in a game that they found the left arm of an ancient marble statue is one thing, and in the next scene they've moved on and they've got it and it's probably under their arm and everybody's forgotten that it's a full-sized arm. But if you put the mannequin arm that you've sprayed up to look like marble on the table in front of them, that's a different experience. And it anchors them in the universe. And it's not necessarily a horrific experience, but it's part of player buy-in and giving people that feeling of sort of an immersive experience.
I would certainly be awesome to slap the marble arm down on the table, wouldn't it?
I've put full 6 foot high steel crowbars on the table for people.
Yeah, rather than just like, you find the marble arm, go, you find this.
Yeah. So like, we'll go and get a crowbar. Well, you know how big and heavy those are. Here you go. It's a different thing. Anyway, but the tailored experience is what I was really talking about, and how you translate that from your personal group onto an actual product that you're going to give to other people, that you're going to be able to, you know, give them the freedom to run any way they want, but they'll still get that tailored experience.
Yeah, I guess that's the difference, right? Because when you've written it for a group you know, or you have a particular audience in mind, you're going to go, oh, this is how it's going to go. You've left maybe multiple threads or strands so people can take it different ways, and then you can go get feedback from it. So you release it out into the wild as a book, and you get feedback about, oh, we did this, we solved it this way, or we went over here, and you're like, that is what you want to get, right? That's just like lots of people experiencing the product in different ways, and then it just ticks back into your head of like, oh, I can do this, I can change it this way, my next thing can be like this. It just gives you lots of kind of ideas as well, I find.
Yeah, sometimes I find that writing games for a large group of people, as you do in a pre-written scenario in a role-playing book, can be quite difficult, because personalizing the horror, which is especially what the new version of Vampire the Masquerade is about, personal horror, is pretty difficult when you are writing a game that It's going to be sold in many different countries to many different groups. How do you make sure that the playing experience is going to be unique to the group? And something that I at least try to do when I write is to make everything as open-ended as possible. I don't want it to be just a watered down scenario, but I don't want to feel like the group is being forced a specific direction. I want to give them the puzzle pieces, and they can do the puzzle, but the puzzle pieces can be connected in many different ways and make many different puzzles. So I find that to be particularly challenging when writing something, because you don't want it to be the same game over and over again.
I mean, I think that's something that, I mean, if we go to the theme of this whole event of international, sort of like tabletop RPG writers, what I think people will discover, and I do understand that obviously even as people from other countries, you are still exposed to that sort of generic mass media culture that's disseminated through the internet, especially nowadays. So in a way, cultural tropes are in a sense more homogenized than ever, but at the same time, when you think about it, it's almost always been that way because we do have a shared human quality, and I think that's why like role-playing games, storytelling driven games are always well regarded, even by people that don't necessarily connect with them as such. Generally, when they then look at them, take the time to, actually, that's quite interesting. Because effectively what you're doing is only what people have been doing literally forever. Like a bunch of folks sitting around a campfire, talking to each other, telling a story, collaborating on it, all the things we regard now. I mean, if we talk about Scandinavia, the Norse myths and all that, which I've always found more resonant, just because the characters, the gods in it, if you like, are very much myopic, as flawed and stupid and make bad decisions as anyone else, so in that sense you can kind of get it, like, why is the world messed up? Well, because our gods are flawed and stupid and make stupid decisions and do stupid things and get tricked and fooled and stuff like that. That all came through a bunch of people sitting around. What could this be? How could that be? How could we figure that out? So in a way, it's a culture that's existed forever. If you want to, a lot of Americans probably watching this, it's come through various cultures into your country also, and it's been the same everywhere. We've all been influenced by that element of collaborative storytelling. It's just human that we want to sit down and communicate. And so necessarily when what we are producing is in effect an ideas factory, if you like. And I suppose Hugh, maybe not so much your if it's a card, it's like there's a set of rules. I mean, each game will be different, but it's more like a case of there's a set of rules, and I suppose the vagaries and how do you want to play that, and giving different options for people rather than
exactly
you must play this deck and you must play it this way. Allowing various things to be competitive, I suppose, is a different sort of take on that. Whereas for us, it's more a case of how can we turn this from John Burke sitting in his big chair with his storybook open saying, right, Jack and Ori time, everyone, like, I'm going to tell you my story about vampires. And instead of that, saying, here's a book of stuff, and from that, you guys together, and not just the storyteller, but obviously it's great if the storyteller can pull a marble arm out of his bum. But that would be a round of applause from me. But effectively the beauty of it is that it's that however many people are sat there around the table in the Zoom call, whatever way it is you do it, are together coming up with something. And I know, I'm sure you guys will be the same, certainly as a storyteller. Have been inspired sometimes by something my players did that I was like, I was playing a D&D game yesterday, and I was literally trying to get them to go in somewhere, right? Like, go in, and they're just like, oh, maybe there's traps, maybe we shouldn't go in. And I had these animals turn up, and the idea was these animals were going to be big scary things, and we're going to go, you better go in there, right? Which is a bit railroady, but there you go. So they came, and the ranger in the group just went, you speak to animals. And I'm like, I forgot you could do that, right? Now, well, I could have been upset about that, but actually I was like, this is brilliant. And I used that to give them a bit of exposition about what was in there that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And that did two things. Firstly, obviously, it got them more interested in going in, but and it was more of a collaborative way of doing it rather than me just go in there now, which was my mistake. But secondly, it also allowed, and this is something that I think we've all touched on so far, it gave the chance for the player to take the starring role in the story, and that's so important. And I think it is, no matter where you're from, that the players, their characters should be the stars. They should be what the story is based around, their story, their progression. And it allowed him that moment to go, I used this spell that I've just had sitting in my sheet that I've never really used, never had the opportunity, and I used that, and that gives us information, it gives us things. And if I hadn't been there, that wouldn't have happened. And that's where it becomes more personal, is that your presence within it allows it to be, that it pushes it in that direction. If that character hadn't existed, if he hadn't been standing at that place at that moment, the story would have went in a completely different direction. That's the best thing about it for me.
Yeah, we got a question in the chat we should probably address. It's Markiosius, Gehenna Gaming, that's asking what are some key differences between what scares people from country to country, if any cultural differences of horror at all. And I think I quickly touched on it when it comes to Scandinavian horror, that kind of mix between what is super realistic and what is very unrealistic. I think that's primarily what we do in Denmark. I will say that Danish horror culture is lacking. There is not a lot of Danish horror movies. There is not a lot of good ones. But I do find that Scandinavia has a very unique look on horror, and that look on horror often is based on darkness, and I know that darkness is something universally used in horror, obviously, but I think specifically for Scandinavians, the people living on the northern side of the world, darkness has a profound effect on our lives because we're surrounded by it so much. Almost half of the year in Denmark, we have more dark hours than we have light hours. So I think that is where all these folkloric kind of stories have also generated from. How do we make sure that our kids don't run out into the forest at night? Okay, they're not gonna listen to reason, so we're just gonna make up that someone is living in the forest. So and they're gonna eat their hands and feet, or they're gonna steal them and put them in a brew. So that is one thing that has definitely influenced Danish horror. I think trolls and witches is a big thing in Danish horror. We have I think it's from 1922. It's called Hexam. It's a very iconic black and white horror movie with no sound that is about witches. And if we go all the way to more modern time, we have Lars von Trier. He's a very controversial person. I don't specifically like him, but he made Antichrist, which is also about witches. So it's kind of following us throughout our story, whether we like it or not. And it's something that I include in my games as well. I wrote about the Scandinavian witch trials and dark eras too. So it's something that I think that I've been influenced as a Scandinavian by. But yeah, I think darkness is very much a theme in Scandinavian horror. What would you guys say is like something you can point at and say, oh, that's definitely a theme for the culture of horror that I've grown up in?
I'm gonna say, well, I grew up in the UK, so I'm gonna leave that to John and Hugh to talk about that. I'm now in Australia. I don't have enough experience of being in Australia to know what's translated over here. But what I will say is I believe that horror is about being human. I think that it's a reflection of us and reveals aspects of what it is to be human. Horror the gods we see in horror, the aspects of things that we're scared of, they're all reflections of who we are. And I think that's why it works globally. And I think that that's also why you get localized things like darkness, which reflect that an aspect of life in that country, and you will get darkness somewhere else, but you might get something else elsewhere, but you will always come down to very foundational principles. I think it's also a great release for us. And you were talking, John, earlier about getting around the fire many years ago and talking stories, and people would share stories, and they were learning experiences, and fear and horror are a learning experience for us. Story is a great tradition of Indigenous Australian culture. I won't talk about it at length, I'm not an expert, but story is very important. And in Western culture, we now experience these things through movies, TV, books. Well, nobody really wants to know what it's like to have their hand cut off in a cabin in the woods. Not really. But we want to experience it because it's a release. So I think that horror is quite universal. I think no matter what we said, we would all furiously agree. So let's do that.
Oh, yeah, I think, I mean, like Northern Europe in general shares a lot of commonality with kind of, fear of the dark, things like werewolves and witches having different things, like, like in the UK, you've got all these standing stones all over, particularly high density in bits of Scotland and bits of southwest in the UK. So people came up with stories to explain why these things existed. And they're not necessarily stories of horror by themselves, but as society changes and becomes, more organized religion, you've got to explain these things that are very different. So you get the devil being involved. So there's a lot of the devil and Satan running through kind of like British horror early on. And then obviously when you get to the mediums of film, you end up with your Peter Cushings and your Christopher Lees doing fantastic stuff, but most of it's, by Hammer Horror, it is a bit hammy by its own name. So I don't think you don't have the same mental impact that some of the modern horror does. Like, I think modern horror, you've either got stuff that's very, very cerebral and is trying to scare you because you don't really know what's going on. So you have your hidden monsters for all this time, or you've just got your slasher horror stuff where it's, well, okay, you're losing your hand in a in a cabin in the woods, but it's not quite as scary as not knowing something, which is, I think the fear of the unknown, I think, is more terrifying, because that comes back to the human nature, right? You always try to explain something and try to understand it. So you come up with these stories, and as we've talked about, we've been doing this for thousands of years. Try to understand us and the world around us. My biggest fear currently is I run out of beer before the pubs reopen in a few weeks, hopefully. So it's very much more of a commercial consumerism based. I just want to be able to do all this stuff that I can't currently do, right? That's a really real fear, and you can almost imagine there's going to be a whole raft of games based on the last 12 months, be they tabletop or board games, because you've got that fear of isolation, the fear of people not understanding you. Yeah, we'll see. I'm not sure I want to play those games, I have to admit.
But you've touched on it there, like pretty much what I was thinking in terms of the local, and again, I think it's very much an international thing. Well, certainly in Scotland, we're scared of Scandinavians coming in big ships and attacking us with axes.
No, why would you be scared of that?
Klara is terrifying to me, sitting there. No, when you talk about things, it touches on the central themes of what horror is, and as Allan said, it's very much a human thing, and there are certain themes, and although I mean, you'd refer to trolls and witches and things like that. Hugh then talked about, the satanic, the devil, that, which is very much like, if you didn't say that was what the scary thing was, then you got set on fire, So that's definitely where that's a big element of British culture, because there was a time when simply to say it wasn't that was literally illegal. But the themes underlying the symbols, if we want to call them that, the trolls, the witches, the darkness, are symbols of things which are more primal and more belonging to humans. And if we understand that, what we talked about, like with Aboriginal culture and stuff like that, they have that very strong sort of storytelling sort of vibe, and that runs through cultures that are just completely disconnected from each other. Therefore, we can conclude that it is certainly a thing that is inherent to the human animal as such, is that desire to communicate and to be understood. And I think one of the driving themes of horror then, as Hugh just touched on there, and Klara had discussed the sort of symbology of it, in terms of the localized aspect, would be the unknown, the fear of loss, the fear of these different things, which are all represented by either an event, i.e. you getting your hand cut off in a cabin in the woods, you've lost your hand, right? You don't want to lose your hand. That's the idea of having only one hand in itself is frightening, because you're like, oh, I've been disabled, right? And I'm scared of that. I have two hands, and that's what I'm used to, and I like that, and I don't want to be reduced to one hand. So you're afraid to lose something that you have. And also the fear of the unknown, of the darkness, of what's beyond the campfire light, what's out there. We don't know what's out there. It could be bad, it could be good, we don't know. And actually, funnily enough, there was I suppose it's not a character, it kind of is, a villain, I suppose, that I wrote in the Night Horrors book for Werewolf the Forsaken, was this thing called The Grandmother. And it was all from a line that I read in the Chronicles of Darkness, like the really early, sort of really, I think it was one of the earliest dark eras, like literally the caveman dark eras. And it was talking about, do not go and beyond the firelight, because we don't know what's out there. And that really struck a chord with me. And I think that is one of the central tropes, central themes of horror, and what makes things scary, is that being unknown. When we look at Cthulhu, for example, it's about unknown things that are far away and we can't understand them. Vampire is about having a world uncovered to you that you didn't know existed, and that's terrifying, and that is preying on people as if they themselves are cattle and stuff like that. Werewolf is about a secret war that exists that you don't know about, that's been fought in the background. And you maybe have unwittingly been used as a tool in that. The Forsaken is about an even more secret war, where it's like the werewolves are actually fighting stuff that comes from beyond the other dimensions. It's more Cthulhuoid, if you want. But all of that pertains to both the fear of the unknown and the fear of loss. And I think that's just a human response, that you don't want these things. You're scared to go outside your comfort zone if you want. And you're also scared mainly because you think if you go over there, you could lose something, including your life, including parts of your body, including your sanity, whatever that is that you want to cling to. And when we talk about the sort of localized element of it, and Hugh touched on it, the thing about, and I think Americans would understand the idea of a Wild West, if you want. And if you think the areas of the UK you referred to, that they were very much Wild West, like rural, not much settlement there. The Romans put up a big wall because they didn't want to go into Scotland where the weather was terrible, and it was more rocky and hilly, and they couldn't farm there, and the people were mental and wanted to kill them all, right? And would come out the forest and stab, and then run away, and you couldn't actually get a proper fight with them and all this. So there's that element of that fear, and this more civilized, if you want, area of the UK, that sort of middle bit of England where it was very heavily farmed, and that was the reality of there. It was cities, big human enclaves growing all the time, and therefore the unknown being pushed back. So the scary things always came from what was beyond that, from the rural areas, from out there. And I think if Americans think about a kind of, as I say, a Wild West type thing, or an Amityville style thing, it's always these kind of small town, you don't know what goes on there really. Like, we're from the big city where there's law and order and the rules apply, and you go out there and it's like the police don't go there, and the government don't care about it, and they've got their own little things, and they all know each other, and they don't know you, and you're suddenly the outsider. What are they up to? What's he building in there? That whole song kind of element of it. And to me, that's that's a universal horror trope, and all that changes from place to place is the symbology. And I'm now going to stop ranting again.
I actually have a question that I'd like to ask, and it comes from this: is how do the different games that we've worked on, Call of Cthulhu, Cult, Vampire, all of those, how do the games deal with these themes? You touched on it a little bit there, John, but I'd love to hear how the others think as well about how the games deal with these different themes that we've talked about are universal but present themselves differently.
I think if taking Vampire, the new edition, I think John touched on it briefly, but it's very much the horror within yourself, the beast within yourself that you are constantly fighting. You're fighting between giving up to the beast and being who you are. And also a very down-to-earth kind of horror where you are, as you're growing older, you're growing to 100, 200, 300 years old, you are slowly losing that connection to reality because you're losing your friends, you're losing your family. You don't want to make new connections. Why would you? You're going to lose them anyway. So it's very much, I think what we try to do with the newer Vampire is to get it back to basics. What is it that's so horrible about being this eternal being? And how does that affect the human psychology? Because a part of you is always human, especially in the beginning of your years vampire. If you look at Cult, which is something else I've been working on, it's very much a religious perspective on horror, which I find quite interesting. It's way more Cthulhu-esque, if you ask me, where there's something nature, something huge, something we cannot even fathom the size of, that is out there that could crush us at any given moment. And how does that affect you? So yeah, I think that's the two things I'm going to touch on. We do have a question from a viewer that we're going to get to. So I think we should touch on this briefly, if we could.
Yeah, so should we look at this question? So does living or growing up where it's easy to come across tangible representations of 500,000+ years of history make it easier to connect to that history of horror for you? So with me, I grew up in a place called Cheltenham, so it's a nice posh bit of the UK, but it had a tall hill in it called like Hampton Hill. It's not a very exciting hill, it's just a hill. But it had a stack on it, so a stack of interesting limestone rock, and that was called the Devil's Chimney. So that's a natural formation. So that isn't humans doing that, but because humans had lived near it for I don't know how long, 1,000, 2,000 years, at some point it been given that name, and it was a piece you could go up and see, and then it kind of it's very real. Just a reminder of how humans like to go, why is this bit of rock standing up there randomly? It's 6 feet, 2 meters away from the rest of the rock, and it's standing, I don't know, 60 feet tall or something like that. And people are trying to understand, why is that bit of rock there? So they make a story around it, as in, it's the Devil's Chimney, he lives underneath the hill, etc., etc. I think wherever humans have been, there's some kind of stories like that around their landscape. Just try to understand it. And then you've got your actual kind of establishment of things like, in the UK, the oldest things that are still used are like castles or some churches which are 1,000 years old or something like that. And some of them have horrific stories attached to them, which are very real. So you've got lots of houses in the UK, like old stately homes that would have hidden priest holes. So when we've had wars between Protestant and Catholics, you've got priests hidden in these holes, and then you've got bad stories about what happens to some of them and the families who hid them and things like that. So there's very, very real horror in some of those established kind of bits of buildings we've got. but that's all, again, back to the human psyche. And we've done that to ourselves because we've had sectarian wars or whatever. But we can now draw from that, and we're using those experiences. Like that's exactly, in Vampire Masquerade, you've got wars between different sects and different ideologies, and that's just about getting human experience into a horror setting again.
I can definitely relate to that. I grew up in a village in northern England called Romilly, which is a very, very old village. It was mentioned in the Doomsday Book, which sounds fantastic, but it was mentioned for non-payment of taxes, which is less fantastic. We had, I don't know if this will be familiar with anybody else, but there was always a white lady ghost story that somebody you knew had seen, either in the woods or in an old church window. That was just common everywhere. Everyone knew it. And then when you were kids, one of the children in a group, when you were daring each other, would always pretend to have seen it and go into some kind of fit of horror, which we would talk about at school the next day. There was always a tunnel under a hill or a road that, as children, we would tell each other scary stories that if you went in there, you would die. And that was just, and one of us would always go in and not die. But another common element, or everybody kind of seems to have had these experiences. And I think that growing up in a place where the local church is 500 years old, the local pub is 340 years old, the estate that you grew up on is on an old burial ground. It permeates. It definitely permeates. So does it help? I think it probably does, but you don't notice it until somebody asks you on a panel 40 years later.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think it's a maybe verging on a yes for me. What I would say to people who aren't from places with maybe a sort of more tangible history, if you like, with the 1,000-year-old churches, as you put it, that does make it easier to connect to those horrible things that have happened in the past and the stories that exist, because there's a relic of it there that you can view. But I would say to Americans certainly watching it that those things exist, and Hugh's referred to around you. If you go to any, your nation, if you want, the land on which you reside is as old as any land that we come from. It's been there for just as long. And it has these things, and it has stories attached to it. You just have to discover them. And something else that Klara touched on that I really kind of popped into my head and resonated with me when talking about vampire in particular is not so much dealing with, and it was a theme of horror that I didn't touch on actually earlier when I was talking about that, is the idea of eternity, right? Eternity is terrifying, right? That going on forever and ever. I mean, you might think you want that, but do you really? So having that sort of history, yes, it connects you to certain stories and certain events more vividly, having the physical reminder of it present. It's like when you go to Berlin and you go into the Reichstag and they've preserved the graffiti that the Russian soldiers left behind as they were sacking the place. What some of the translations they've got, and you could just tell how personal it was for those guys that were doing it. And toppling this fascist regime that had murdered millions of them and their families and all that. So, that's a very tangible, and they've decided to keep that because they want that tangible representation of what occurred. They never want to forget it. That I can understand. But horror in itself, the actual things aren't necessarily to do with nationhood. I mean, if I wouldn't personally be bothered if a person from Texas, right, wanted to take a Scottish myth or something they found interesting and horrifying and that their resonated with their players. I don't think it would be for me to say, well, that doesn't belong to you, it belongs to me, right? I mean, I suppose I'm from here, but at the end of the day, it's for, they can have it. Eternity stretches out ahead of us, right? And to me, that's the thing. That going on, the thing that never dies, that's the scary thing, isn't it? Like, or worse, being the thing that never dies. How could you remain human throughout all of that? So there's so much more to horror than just looking at the past and saying that was horrible. It is, and it gives you the basis for a lot of things, but it's not necessarily everything in terms of what we try to do. Certainly not myself, and I don't think certainly Klara either, in any of her stuff that I've read, is always to do more with what you referred to with you're going on forever. The horror is very much within yourself. You're part of that landscape, and the events happen around you, and the things are around you, and they are terrifying to some extent. But what's really terrifying is, what are you capable of? You're the same as that person that murdered those women. You're the same as that person that killed those children, that did these horrible things. You're the same animal. You're capable of that. You have that potential inside you. That's the fear, that's the terror, that's the beast that we refer to in Vampire. And in Cthulhu, it's like the cultists, these boggle-eyed, mad people, you know, and all the rest of it. And cult, if you're talking about, it's all very based in realism. It's something Klara's certainly touched on in everything she's said so far, is that you connect it, and we've all referred to the emotional connection. And that's how you connect it, is by saying, that could be me, you're there, but for the grace of God, or however you want to put it. You're capable of that. If you wanted to, you could take a claw hammer and go round to, you know, someone's house and bash their brain in. You wouldn't do that, but you could. It's there. It's available. That option always exists. It's made tangible for us in what you've referred to 500,000-year-old representations of times when that did occur. But it's not necessarily something which is necessarily British or Scandinavian or Chinese or whatever you want to call it. It's human, and that's what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think as long as humans exist, there will be horror. As long as there's humans to interpret what is happening around them and to put that into a psychological process, I think there will be horror. And I think being in a country that has existed for many, many, many years, and have seen many religions pass through, seen many kind of cultures pass through, I think what is interesting is to see how horror kind of evolves, where in the Viking ages, if you look at the witch, the vulva was a good thing. He was a good person to have around. It was someone you would welcome into your house. It's someone that would help you with ceremonies. But then as soon as Catholicism takes over, then the witch is suddenly, you know, a bad thing because they contradict the church. And now back to where we are now with Wiccans, being a witch is suddenly seen as something, you know, good again. And so it's interesting to see how it kind of just does a 180. And yeah, I think coming from a country that has that much history and that much experience kind of helps with at least the folklore part, because we've had more time to sit down and be like, oh, I wonder why there is a fog around the lake. And now that must be because the fog man is brewing something, you know, that kind of like historical time that we had, that kind of like expansive time we've had, has kind of given us more time to just collect more folklore. Yeah.
I think if I was to ask, oh, sorry, I'll let you.
I really like what you said there, Klara, about the changing view of witches. I really enjoy the ambiguity of horror in games, and the different points of view you can take, and the way that you can use that to play with players and situations to give them, this is horrific, but is it right or wrong? Probably neither. Yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, it's just quite interesting. I have an example. I know I keep talking about Danish folklore, but it's quite interesting because we have something called Nisse, and a Nisse was a small person, not a real person. It's this big, that would live in farms, and they would live on farm ceilings, and you would have to sacrifice something to the Nisse. If you didn't sacrifice something to the Nisse, something really bad would happen. And it wouldn't just be small pranks. It would be the Nisse would kill your livestock and burn down your farm. So you better sacrifice to the Nisse. And that has just kind of survived history. Now in modern history, Nisse is seen as something we connect to Christmas. They're kind of Santa's old helpers. And they're seen as something good, something that brings gifts to children. But despite the view of this kind of figure has changed, we still sacrifice to the Nisse. We still put up porridge on the ceiling for the Nisse to eat, just to make sure that, you know, if there is someone up there, that they don't burn down our house or do something bad.
I like it. I think we're being told to wrap up and go ahead and go around and tell everybody where they can find us online. And so you can find me, you can find my website at type40.com.au. If you want to connect with me on Twitter for chats, you can find me at _TARDIS_guy. And if you ever need any help with the Chaosium Miskatonic Repository Community Content Creation Program, please contact me via their website, and I can help you get your scenarios up on Drive-Through Roleplay and give you some hints and tips about that.
Me next, okay. You can't find me because I'm hiding. They've told us to wrap up, and wrapping up is always a good idea in Scotland. So here we go. You can locate me on Twitter at John P. Burke 82, all the one word. I am that angry-looking, young, better, more attractive person of the picture that was taken 10 years ago. So don't be shocked when you see the grey-headed, ugly guy in front of you. That is actually me. And yep, you can touch base with me there if you like. I don't talk much. I tend to just read. But if you talk to me, I will talk back. And yeah, you can read pretty much my stuff throughout various Onyx Path game lines. I think one thing we should touch on before we, and I think we would all agree with this, is in terms of being an international writer, the disconnect certainly that I feel of being away from the main hub of the industry, the American, very much all the conventions are there, all the things are there. It's hard to get to, it's expensive to interact with. It's easier now with the internet. But yes, throw us up a one, come and talk to us and
you are kidding me, aren't you?
Yeah. And we will
in Australia.
We will delight you with our patter and our wonderful anecdotes about porridge on your roof. And yeah, so come and talk to me. I am friendly.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, on XLadyGamerX, and the same name on Instagram. I post all kinds of stuff. Yeah, hit me up.
Finally, you can find me at blackchantry.com or on Twitter as H Angseesing.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. We appreciate you. And don't go anywhere. We'll be back in less than 30 minutes with Just Add Magic, cooking with Meredith and Hollywood for breakfast time for us on the East Coast and Central U.S. So thank you, everyone, and stay tuned for more Virtual HorrorCon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.